At 19, she was sold as damaged goods until the silent rancher learned who damaged her. Dust Mill, Arizona Territory, spring of 1877. The wind dragged dry dust across the cracked main road, lifting it into the faces of townsfolk and horses alike. It was market day, the busiest day of the season, and the square was choked with noise. The neigh of restless mustangs, boots grinding over gravel, the clipped tones of traders arguing prices, and the stench of sweat, leather, and tobacco hanging thick in the air. Among the bustle, a stagecoach pulled to a halt. The door opened slowly, and a young woman stepped down. Her dress had once been white, silk with lace and Eastern stitching. Now, dulled by dust and time, it hung loose from her thin frame, too elegant for a place like Dust Mill, yet somehow too fragile to be anywhere else. She was 19. Isadora McKinley blinked beneath the afternoon sun. Her hair, once carefully pinned, now fell in uneven strands around her face. Her eyes searched the crowd with a hollow calm, not fear, not defiance. Just silence, the silence of someone who had already lost too much. Behind her, Henry McKinley adjusted his coat and stepped down. His hands trembled despite the heat. Once a wealthy man with land and lineage, Henry now looked more like a desperate gambler clinging to the last coin in his pocket. He didn't look at Isa. He didn't take her hand. He walked ahead, toward the waiting man at the corral. Bart Crowley stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt. He was thick-necked, his shirt stained with old sweat and whiskey, the kind of man who owned too much land and not enough conscience. As Isa approached, Bart grinned. "Pretty as promised," he said. Henry's voice cracked. "She's healthy. She reads. She speaks French. I don't need her to talk," Bart cut in. "Just need her to know when to lie still." He held out a folded paper, a crude marriage agreement, more transaction than union. Henry took it without hesitation, signed his name with a shaking hand, and passed it back. Bart laughed as he signed. "Damaged goods go cheap, but sometimes broken things behave better." From across the square, a man stood near a row of tethered horses. Thatcher Kane. He didn't move, didn't speak, he simply watched. He held a pouch of salve in one hand, supplies for an injured mustang back home. That had been his only reason for coming to town. But when Isa stepped from that coach, something shifted in his chest. He hadn't taken his eyes off her since. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a long gray duster. A scar crawled up the right side of his neck, disappearing beneath his collar, a reminder from the war that had taken his voice. His right hand, stiff from old shrapnel, clenched and unclenched slowly at his side. Isa didn't see him at first. But as Bart tugged her forward, her eyes scanned the crowd and landed on Thatcher. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. For the first time in hours, maybe days, Isa's shoulders stopped trembling. Just for a second, Bart pulled her toward his wagon. "Come on, girl. Time to earn your keep." Isa didn't resist. She didn't speak. She just walked. A grizzled man nearby muttered, half to himself, half to no one, "That silent one hates when men call women goods. Lost his sister that way, some say." Thatcher didn't react. But his jaw tensed. Isa's dress swept across the dirt. As she passed the corral, her skirt caught the blood-soaked earth where a steer had been slaughtered earlier that morning. The white turned red. Still, she didn't flinch. But just before Bart pushed her into the wagon, she looked back. Not at her father, not at the townspeople. She looked at Thatcher, and he was still watching. Their eyes locked, just for a breath. No words, no gestures, just two souls, bruised and worn, recognizing something wordless in each other. And then she was gone, swallowed into the back of the wagon, the door slamming shut behind her like a coffin lid. Thatcher stood motionless. But in his silence, something had begun. Bart's ranch sat 10 miles west of Dust Mill, where the land flattened and the wind never stopped moving. It was a sprawl of dust, barbed wire, and sagging wooden fences, with a barn that leaned like it was tired of standing. The house itself was 2 stories of creaking wood and silent dread, shaded by a dead cottonwood tree that hadn't seen a green leaf in years. Isa was yanked off the wagon and dragged through the dirt like a sack of grain. The ranch hands barely looked at her. Just another body passed around, another mouth to control. She was pushed into a windowless storage room at the edge of the main house. The door shut behind her with a clank, and the iron latch dropped into place with a sound that settled heavy into her bones. Inside, it smelled of rust and mold. One lantern hung crooked from a hook, casting a sickly yellow light that flickered like it didn't want to witness what it illuminated. The walls were lined with crates, ropes, and animal feed. A rake leaned in the corner beside a shovel with dried blood on the handle. In the back sat a cot, barely wide enough for her to curl into. Bart leaned against the doorway, chewing something foul, his thumbs hooked in his belt like he owned the world. "You'll learn how things work here," he said, voice thick with rot and power. "You sleep when I say, you eat if I remember. You speak only when spoken to." Isa didn't move. She stared straight ahead, past him, through him. Bart snorted. "You're already broken. That's good. Makes things easier." He slammed the door, and the bolt slid shut like a judge passing sentence. Hours passed. The lantern burned low. Isa didn't cry. She sat still, knees to her chest, listening to the creak of boards, the faint clink of spurs down the hallway, the muffled laughter of drunk men somewhere far away. Coyotes howled in the desert distance, long and low like ghosts. When the house finally settled into silence, she moved. She tore a splinter from the side of a crate and began to work at the edge of the latch. Her fingers bled, her breath hitched. Her body ached from bruises already blooming beneath her skin. But she kept going. The night air outside was knife-sharp, cold. Stars burned overhead like distant eyes. She pushed through the door and ran. Barefoot, across the sand, into the hills. Every thorn found her. Her dress snagged on scrub brush. Her feet tore open on rocks. Her blood dotted the desert behind her. But she kept running, away from Bart, away from the room, away from the price on her body, and the silence they had tried to force into her soul. Thatcher Kane rode slow beneath the pines of a narrow canyon, headed home with a saddlebag of herbs and powder for his horse's leg. The moon hung low, shadows stretching long between the trees. His mount snorted softly as they climbed a shallow rise. And then he saw her, a pale figure stumbling through the brush, half limping, half crawling, dress torn, feet raw and bloodied. Isa. She didn't see him at first. When she finally looked up, eyes wide and wild with pain and terror, she froze. He stopped his horse and slid from the saddle. He said nothing. He took off his coat and stepped forward slowly, each movement careful, like one might approach a wounded fawn. Isa stared at him, breath jagged, her lips split, hands scraped. She looked like she expected him to yell, to grab her, to hurt. But he didn't. He just held out the coat. She blinked. And then, like a branch finally breaking, she crumpled forward. Thatcher caught her before she hit the ground. She was featherlight and shaking. Still without a word, he lifted her gently, placed her sideways in the saddle, then swung up behind her. He wrapped the coat around her shoulders and steadied her with one arm. They rode back into the dark. No words spoken. None needed. Thatcher's ranch lay tucked between 2 jagged ridges, where the wind softened and the sky felt closer to the earth. The trail in was narrow and rough, a path only those with reason or memory dared take. By the time they arrived, Isa had fallen into a half-sleep. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her body leaned against him, light and still, like a sparrow caught in storm. The house was plain. 2 rooms, no glass in the windows, only linen nailed to wooden frames. Inside, the hearth flickered low, casting long shadows over the worn floors. Thatcher carried Isa in and laid her gently on the small cot near the fire. He covered her with a wool blanket, then he placed a tin cup of water beside her bed, a folded cloth, and a salve he'd made for his horse's leg. He knew it worked for torn skin too. Still silent, he moved away, took his bedroll to the far corner of the room, and sat. When Isa woke, the light was gray, and the fire had gone to embers. She winced as she sat up, touching her bandaged foot. Then she noticed the untouched bread, the water. The note carved lightly into the wood beside the cup. "You are safe." It was not written in ink, but traced in quiet care. She turned to the man across the room. He was tending a pot over the hearth now. When he felt her eyes, he glanced back and nodded once. Not a word. That night, she tried signing the only word she remembered from a friend back east who had a deaf brother. Slowly, fingers trembling, she signed, "Thank you." Thatcher paused. His lips parted slightly. Then, gently, he formed a reply. "You're safe here." He moved his hand slowly, deliberately, so she would see each motion. When he finished, he looked to her for a sign of understanding. She nodded. And for the first time since Charleston, Isa smiled. Not the smile of a lady trained to charm, or a girl taught to obey. It was small, but it was real. They said nothing else that evening. But as the stars rose over the canyon, and wind whispered softly through the cracks in the wooden walls, Thatcher stepped outside. He looked up, then pointed. Isa followed him out barefoot. He gestured to the sky, a shooting star cut across the night in a single golden arc. She gasped. Thatcher glanced at her. Her eyes shimmered. Neither of them spoke, but both of them cried. Quietly, fully, like a spring breaking through stone. Not because of pain, but because, for the first time in too long, neither of them was alone. The sky turned to flame above Dustmill's rim, streaks of blood-orange light pouring over the canyon as the sun began its slow descent. The wind was dry, restless. Birds scattered early, sensing the shift in the air, the kind that came before something broke. Thatcher was in the paddock, mending a broken rail with steady, quiet hands. Isa was nearby, tying up bundles of dried herbs beneath the porch roof. It had been nearly 4 days since she arrived. They'd spoken little, only with hands, with glances, and the way he gently left the stronger bread for her plate. Peace hung between them, like breath held too long, until the dogs started barking. It came like a wave, sharp howls, frantic scratching, then the thunder of hooves. 3 riders stormed through the outer gate, dust rising in angry clouds. Isa froze. She knew that shape, that voice before the man even opened his mouth. Bart Crowley. He pulled his horse hard, jumped down before it stopped. 2 men flanked him, both armed, both grinning with the cold edge of cruelty. Bart stepped forward, coat open, revolver gleaming at his side. "Well, hell," he spat. "Ain't this a surprise?" Thatcher stood straight, but didn't move from the fence line. Bart pointed at Isa. "That girl's mine. Ran off from my property like a wild bitch." Isa stumbled back, instinctively stepping behind Thatcher. Her hands trembled as she clutched the railing. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at Bart. He simply raised his hand, palm out, as if to say, "Stop." Bart chuckled. "You really gonna play hero, mute boy?" He nodded to one of his men. A torch was struck. The flame hissed to life and was thrown toward the wooden barn. In seconds, dry straw caught like oil, and fire licked upward into the sky. Isa screamed. Thatcher moved before she could blink. Without hesitation, he sprinted across the yard, past Bart, past the other men, toward the rising wall of flame. "Don't be stupid," Bart shouted. "It's just horses." But Thatcher didn't stop. Inside the barn, the Mustangs screamed in panic, hooves slamming against stalls. Smoke thickened, billowing from every crack. Isa ran to the doorway, coughing, eyes wide with terror. She could barely see through the blaze, but she saw his shape. Thatcher inside, untying leads, guiding panicked animals out through the rear gate. The fire snapped like a whip. A beam collapsed. Isa dropped to her knees, shaking. Her hands moved wildly through the air, spelling out words she didn't know how to shout. "Don't die for me." Thatcher looked up, met her eyes through smoke, and he smiled. It was faint, soot-smudged, broken at the edges, but it was there. Then he turned, disappearing back into the barn for one last horse. Isa screamed. The smoke rolled thicker now. The heat blistered her skin even from the doorway. Bart swore behind her, stepping back as the fire roared too close. One of his men had already fled. Moments later, from the far end of the barn, a door burst open. Thatcher stumbled out, dragging the last Mustang, his shirt scorched, one side of his face black with ash. The horse bolted past him, terrified but free. He collapsed to one knee, coughing hard. Isa ran to him. She knelt beside him, hands grasping his shoulders, shaking with sobs. He raised a hand weakly, fingers signing. "It's safe. They're safe." And for the first time, Isa didn't care about what had happened to her, only what he had done for her. He had gone into fire, not for glory, not for show, but because living things should never be left to burn. She pressed her forehead to his, and they wept, in silence, in smoke, in the fading light of a barn that no longer stood. The barn had burned down to a black skeleton by morning. Smoke still curled faintly from the charred remains. The smell of ash clung to the wind. Inside the cabin, Isa dipped a cloth into a bowl of cool water and wrung it out slowly. Thatcher sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, shirtless, his shoulder and ribs wrapped in rough bandages. The side of his face was raw but healing. He watched her, silent as always, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. She knelt beside him, gently pressing the damp cloth to the edges of a burn. He winced but didn't move away. "I should say thank you," she whispered. He didn't sign anything in return. Because he didn't need to. They sat in silence a long while. The fire outside was gone, but something heavier still burned inside her. Isa looked down at the cloth, now stained with ash and a smear of blood. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice cracked. "The real reason I was sold, it wasn't just the debt." Thatcher looked at her, waiting. Isa swallowed hard. "When I was 14, there was a man at the convent school. A supervisor. Everyone trusted him. But one night, he came into my room." Her fingers curled around the edge of the basin. "I told the Mother Superior. She said I was imagining things, that I read too many stories. When my father came, I thought he'd take me home. Instead, he had me committed." Her eyes met Thatcher's. "He said I was sick, that I was damaging the family name. He signed papers that said I was delusional. I spent 7 months in a place where they tied me to beds and made me drink things that burned my throat." Thatcher's hand rested on his knee, motionless. Isa continued, her voice smaller. "When I was finally released, he acted like none of it happened, like I should be grateful. But when the debts came, when he had nothing left to sell, he sold me too." She looked down again, ashamed of the story spilling from her mouth. "I have never told anyone that, not even the nuns, not the girls in the ward, not myself." A long silence stretched between them. Then Thatcher reached into the inside pocket of his coat. From it, he pulled a small piece of wood, no bigger than his palm, rough-edged, the bark still clinging to one side. On its flat surface, carved in uneven lines with the tip of his blade, were 3 words: "I believe you." Isa stared at it. Her lip trembled. Her breath caught. Then everything shattered, the walls she had built, the silence she had worn like armor. She folded over and sobbed, deep, shaking sobs that racked her whole body. She pressed her face into her hands and cried like she had never allowed herself to cry before. Thatcher did not try to stop her. He did not speak or touch her. He simply sat beside her, still, present, listening with everything he had. When she finally lifted her head, tears streaking her cheeks, her hand reached for the wooden piece. She held it to her chest. Not because it fixed everything, but because someone had finally believed her, without questions, without doubt, without trying to fix her. Just believed. And that was the beginning of healing. The sky had darkened to the color of steel, and the air grew heavy with the threat of rain. Thunder rumbled low in the distance like a growl in the chest of the earth. Isa stood near the porch, braiding dried lavender stems into a bundle. She paused, sensing something before she heard it, that strange stillness before danger, when even the birds held their breath. Out by the barn, Thatcher was hammering a new hinge into the rebuilt stable door. His strokes were steady, purposeful. But then the dogs began to bark, sharp, frantic howls that tore through the stillness like glass. Thatcher looked up. Dust rose on the far trail. 4 riders approached fast, their silhouettes dark against the pale ridge. As they thundered through the gate, Isa's blood turned to ice. Bart Crowley. He pulled his horse hard and jumped down, boots hitting dirt with purpose. 3 men followed, each armed, rough, eyes hungry for chaos. Bart's voice cut the air. "Bring her out. I am done waiting. You think, just because you can tame horses, you can keep my woman?" Thatcher didn't respond. He stood straight, tools still in hand, unmoving. Isa stepped forward. She didn't hide behind him this time. Her knees trembled, but she stood tall. Her voice was quiet, but clear. "I am not your anything, Bart. Not anymore. And I am not afraid to speak." Bart's eyes narrowed. "You filthy little." He charged, hand reaching for her arm, but Thatcher stepped between them like a stone wall. His left hand rose slowly, palm forward, a single clear sign. "Stop." Bart snarled and waved his men forward. The first man lashed out with a leather whip, striking across Thatcher's chest, then reached for Isa's waist. Thatcher grabbed his wrist, twisted sharply, a sickening crack followed, and flung the man to the ground. The second man lunged with a knife. Thatcher ducked, slammed a shoulder into his gut, then spun him into the side of the barn wall with force. The third came next, swinging a club. Thatcher turned, swept the man's legs out from under him, then pinned his arm in a lock so fast the man screamed before the bone gave way. All 3 lay groaning in the dirt. Bart stood there, stunned, then rage twisted his face. He drew his pistol and leveled it at Thatcher's back. Isa screamed, "No, do it, and you'll hang. You'll die in a cell, not in the open." Thatcher didn't flinch. He turned slowly, eyes calm. No fear, no anger, only stillness. He opened his hands, empty. Then, without breaking eye contact, he knelt, not in surrender, but as if to say, "Go ahead. Let everyone see who you really are." Bart's hand trembled. Then, the thunder of hooves. Sheriff Keller and 2 deputies rode in, hard, rifles drawn. "Drop it, Bart," Keller shouted. "Now." Bart hesitated. "Do it," Keller snapped. "You've already burned barns, threatened lives, and violated court warnings. You think anyone's covering for you now?" Bart cursed and dropped the gun. It hit the ground with a final, hollow clatter. The deputies dismounted, cuffed the wounded men, then clapped irons around Bart's thick wrists. "You can't do this," Bart shouted. "That mute bastard stole my woman." Isa stepped forward, her voice cutting through the air. "I was never yours, and now you're nothing." Bart's mouth opened, but no words came. The rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, washing the dust from the air. The townspeople, drawn by the noise, had gathered by the fence. They said nothing, just watched as Bart Crowley, once untouchable, was hauled away like any other criminal. A little boy at the back tugged on his mother's dress and asked, "Why doesn't the quiet man say anything?" His mother looked at Thatcher, who stood watching the last of the horses settle. "Because good men do not need to shout," she said. "They speak with what they do, and hearts listen better that way." And with that, the ranch fell quiet again. But in Isa's chest, a storm had cleared. The dust had barely settled over Dustmill, but peace had returned to the Canyon Ranch. Bart Crowley and his men were gone, hauled off in shackles, and the town buzzed with murmurs and speculations. Yet here, far from the courthouse whispers and judgmental stares, there was only silence, not the fearful kind, but the kind born from survival. Isa swept ash from the barn floor. Her sleeves rolled to her elbows. The sting of smoke still lingered in the wood, but she worked steadily, methodically. Nearby, Thatcher rebuilt the fence line one post at a time. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Every nail driven into wood, every tool cleaned and hung back in its place, said the same thing: "We're still here, alive, together." That night, Isa lit the oil lamp and sat at the old table with a blank piece of paper before her. The pen trembled in her grip, but her resolve did not. She had written letters before, apologies, reports, thank yous, but never one like this. Thatcher watched from the doorway. "I need to tell them," she said quietly, her voice barely louder than the flame. "Not just my aunt, the courts, the papers. The truth has to live somewhere besides inside me." She began to write. It wasn't elegant. It didn't need to be. She told the whole story. The assault at 14, behind convent walls, her cries for help that were silenced by a man more concerned with his reputation than his daughter's life. The hospital room where she was locked away, her sanity questioned because it was more convenient than the truth. And the final betrayal, being sold like livestock to erase a debt. She didn't stop until every word was down, her hand aching, her heart lighter. When she finished, she signed the bottom in thick, steady ink. Isadora McKinley. Thatcher stepped forward. He didn't speak. He only placed his hand gently on her shoulder, firm, warm, steady. She leaned into it for a moment and whispered, "I'm not hiding anymore." A month passed. Then, one morning, a stranger on horseback approached the ranch. He wore a black coat and carried papers sealed with the mark of the federal government. Isa met him at the gate. He handed her the notice. A formal summons for Henry McKinley, charged with human trafficking, obstruction of justice, and willful misdiagnosis for personal gain. Isa, read every word. Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes didn't water. "He thought I'd stay afraid forever," she said to no one in particular. "But today he'll have to fear me." When it was time, Isa rode into Dustmill again, not alone this time, but with a federal agent at her side. She wore a white dress, the same one from the spring fair, though now it was clean, mended by her own hands. The town watched her ride by, but no one dared speak. At the courthouse, she took the stand and told the story once more, this time not in ink, but in her own voice. She spoke clearly, without pause, without apology. People listened, they didn't interrupt. Even those who had whispered about her before couldn't look away now. When she finished, the room was silent. Then, a woman in the back rose, walked slowly to her, and took her hand. She didn't say a word, but the grip said everything. Sheriff Keller, sitting near the bench, finally spoke. "You're not a broken girl, Miss McKinley. You're proof that some things bend but don't break." Later that evening, Isa knelt beside the barn's blackened foundation. In her hand was a pouch she'd carried for years, lavender seeds wrapped in her mother's old scarf. One by one, she pressed the seeds into the soil. The land had burned, but it wasn't dead. Thatcher walked over, something wooden in his arms. He set it down beside her, a rocking chair, hand carved from the charred remains of the old barn beams. She looked at it, then at him, tears rising but not falling. With her hands, she signed, "It'll bloom in the summer, like me." He smiled softly and replied in kind, "And it'll last, like us." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of lavender and fire. They sat together in silence, surrounded by ash, hope, and the quiet promise of something new. The late spring sun spilled golden light over the hills, casting long, warm shadows across the valley. The sky blushed with the last hues of day, pale rose melting into soft gold, fading slowly into indigo. The wind, which often rattled through the dry hills, had gentled, leaving only the faintest breeze to stir the tall grasses. Dustmill lay quiet in the distance, too far to interrupt the stillness that had wrapped itself like a soft blanket around the ranch. Isa sat on the porch in a simple cotton dress, her legs folded beneath her on the wooden steps, her toes tracing idle circles in the dust. Her hair was tied back with an old strip of faded fabric, once torn in escape, now a quiet token of survival. The air smelled of lavender, horses, and sun-warmed wood. She watched the herd grazing along the fence line, their bodies calm, tails flicking lazily, unaware of the storms their caretakers had weathered. Beside her sat Thatcher, silent as always, his broad frame relaxed, arms resting on his knees, gaze not fixed on the horses or the land, but on her. Not with urgency, not with hunger, but with quiet reverence, like one might look at something rare that could never quite be earned. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was sacred, full of everything they had endured, everything they had healed, and all the words they had chosen not to say. Isa turned slowly toward him. Her expression soft, her eyes unreadable and open. She placed one hand gently over her own heart, letting it rest there a moment. Then, with quiet certainty, she reached for his hand. Their fingers intertwined, and she guided it to her chest, then to his, pressing it lightly against his heart. Their eyes locked, no signs, no speech, just breath and shared gravity. In that moment, everything was understood. She didn't need to ask if he loved her. He didn't need to say that he did. The knowing lived in the space between their hands, in the warmth of her leaning in the way he wrapped his arm around her shoulders without hesitation. The wind rustled the lavender beside the barn. A foal nickered softly in the field, and the last sliver of sunlight dipped behind the ridge, carrying with it the weight of the past and lighting the promise of tomorrow. Not all love is loud. Some of it is steady, rooted, eternal. And some hearts speak best in silence. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the silence, the pain, and the love that bloomed where no words were spoken, then don't let this be the end. Hit that hype button to show your love. It helps more than you know. And if you're new here, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable tales of forbidden love, redemption, and the kind of devotion that could survive even the lawless land of the frontier. Because out here, where bullets miss but hearts don't, love always leaves an echo. We'll see you on the next ride. Until then, stay wild, stay brave, and stay in love.